Thank you, Claire. And it's a real pleasure to have you all with us today. I'm so pleased that we can have Professor Lewis with us and that so many of you have turned out for this presentation. And Rachel, you can take us to the next slide, please. And so Policy Horizons Canada, as many of you know, is the Government of Canada's Centre for Strategic Foresight. We provide horizontal services across government to help policymakers get a better sense of their potential future policy landscape and to help design policies and programs and activities that are more robust and more resilient in the face of an uncertain future. We're currently engaged in many or a number of really interesting foresight projects, and some of which I have to say, Professor Lewis, may show some of the imprint of your thinking as we met with you early on in the process of designing our social futures portfolio. Some of you are already engaged in our bio-digital convergence foresight project. That's about when bio and digital combine and create some new third space. We're pushing out social futures to understand in particular the evolving landscape for social connection and also for the process of sense making. We have completed and are continuing a good amount of work in the area of the next digital economy and the future of value in that economy, and on the future of work. And finally, we have just recently completed a initial offering to government on the futures that emerge out of potential uncertain futures that emerge out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're continuing that work with partners across government. So I'd like to take this opportunity, it's a real pleasure to introduce you to Professor Jason Edward Lewis. He is a digital media poet, an artist, and a software designer. He founded OBX Laboratory for Experimental Media, where he directs research and creation projects exploring computation as a creative and cultural material. Along with the artist Skawanati, he co-directs the Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, the Skins Workshop on Aboriginal Storytelling and Video Game Design, and the Initiative for Indigenous Futures. Professor Lewis is deeply committed to developing intriguing new forms of expression by working on the conceptual, critical, creative, and technical levels simultaneously. He's the University Research Chair in Computational Media and Indigenous Future Imaginary, as well as the Professor of Computation Arts at Concordia University in Montreal. Born and raised in Northern California, Professor Lewis is Hawaiian and Samoan. And Professor Lewis, it's a real pleasure to have you here. The short conversation that we had a couple of years ago was quite influential to us, as is your paper, which I hope you'll mention and speak about a bit, on making kin with machines, which I recommend to everyone every chance that I get. Professor Lewis, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Eric, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Claire, for getting us started, and for Rachel for coordinating. It's been a pleasure working with you. Yeah, that was a really interesting conversation we had when you, Eric, and Thomas Baines and Lisa Dixon came to our studio for a visit and had a conversation with with Skawanati, my wife and my collaborator, and with my colleague Heather Iglilorti about these sorts of things. So I appreciate that conversation. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today through the ether, and I hope everything goes smoothly in terms of technical fun of doing all this stuff remotely these days. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and okay, there we go. Can you guys see that title screen? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you really great.
Okay, so I will go ahead. Actually, let me just rearrange something here a little bit. Okay, so let me just get going. So I think it's important in these contexts to be really clear about my positionality. So I'm Hawaiian Samoan, as was mentioned in my bio by Eric. But I was adopted out at 6 months by a white family and raised in Northern California mountain country. I was not raised in an Indigenous community and only started a slow journey back when I went to university. I don't speak for either Hawaiians or Samoans, nor for any other Indigenous community. What I can speak for and take responsibility for is the work I've done over the last 2 decades, collaborating with various Indigenous communities here in North America and in Hawaii, looking at the intersection of computational technology and indigeneity. So I'm an academic now, but I spent the first third of my professional career in industry working with technology research labs in Silicon Valley. I have a long-standing commitment to trying to understand computational technology, both in the details, sort of what's really going on with it at a technical level, but also in the role that it plays in how we structure our society. So lastly, positioning, I'm an artist, and I believe that creative practice is a core component in creating the futures that we want. As I'm sure this group is well aware, we make fundamental mistakes when we do not imagine well and fully what our technological choices might lead to. So that's me, or at least a couple different slices on me. What I want to do now is just give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So it's going to be in 3 parts. Talk about this idea of the future imaginary. Going to have about 10 minutes describing the concept of the future imaginary, 10 minutes showing some examples of future imaginaries, both from work in which I am involved and from others, and 10 minutes going more deeply into a case study for the future imaginary building, which is going to be about the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence Working Group. So we have limited time. I'm going to move fast. If it's too fast, please don't hesitate to ask questions or ask Claire to ask me to slow down. We have a healthy Q&A periods afterwards, which I'm very excited about, that we'll actually have enough time, I think, hopefully, to get into some good dialogue about what I'm talking about today. Okay, so what is a future imaginary, or what is the future imaginary? So the future imaginary is about visions of the future that are shared by a group of people and used to motivate change in the present. They provide communities with a shared vocabulary for discussing the future and strategies for getting the futures they desire. So such imaginaries include both the macro, so social configurations, political structures, technological infrastructure, and the micro, what we see, say, and do in the mundane day-to-day. They centrally incorporate capacity building within the community so the community can take control of how such futures get built. As is obvious by now, I'm sure I'm going to be talking about work in various Indigenous communities, but I think the term can be applied to any community that one might want to define. So in thinking about the future imaginary, I draw on the work in part on sociologist Charles Taylor's notion of the social imaginary. To quote him, the way ordinary people imagine their social surroundings, not expressed in theoretical terms, but carried in images, stories, and legends. And I think that term, not expressed in theoretical terms, is important because what I believe Taylor was trying to get at is that these future, in his case, social imaginaries, that much of what we take to be true in our everyday lives are not the product of some theory. They're just products of our everyday interactions with each other. And I wanted to capture that everydayness in the work that we're doing. So it's also based in part on literary scholar Grace Dillon's positioning of Indigenous futurism as a method for establishing Indigenous presence in futures that are often bereft of brown bodies. And then also in part on Adrienne Marie Brown's analysis of how speculative fiction can be used to practice the future together as a means of motivating social activism. So that's the background. Let's talk some concretely about creating future imaginaries. And the way I see it is the future imaginary is a set of strategies we use them to develop these ideas about how we want things to go in the future. And there's sort of 5 key components for at least the way that I think about it, and particularly thinking about it from an Indigenous point of view. So the first is revising our sense of what is possible. I love this quote from Scott Richard Lyons. He's a literature professor at Syracuse University, where he says, "The pursuit of sovereignty is to revise not our past, but our possibilities." And what he's getting at there, I think, is, that understanding and honoring our history is not an exercise in nostalgia or grievance, which is how it often gets characterized, I think, from non-Indigenous context. But really, it's a foundation. Don't know what happened there. It's a foundation on which to build a more complete picture of ourselves after centuries of colonial critiques that have corroded our knowledge of and confidence in our own abilities. It's about remembering what we are capable of when we have the ability to determine our actions ourselves. So the second strategy is asking our own questions. So Kanaka Maoli scholar, so Hawaiian scholar, Manu Myers writes about the importance of asking the questions that are important to our communities, then rather than having questions imposed on us. So this happens all the time, where people from outside our communities think they know what the important questions are. Partially sometimes it's patronizing. They're like, we know what the important questions are for you, but often I find there's just an assumption of universality, which is that, the questions that are important to me must be the questions that are important to you. And so part of what Myers is saying is like, really, part of what we have to do is we have to consistently change the script and push back against questions that are being asked of us and ask our own questions. So examples are, we get asked, how do we fix your community? But the question we're interested in is, how do we further enable our communities continue thriving, right? There's an assumption of thriving and an assumption of continuity there that's not in the first question. Or how do we use knowledge to dominate and subdue nature, right? So this is sort of the story of kind of Western capitalism. That's not the question we tend to ask, at least the people I've worked with. And that question is more, how does our knowledge allow us to coexist productively with our territory? And then just a final example is, often get asked, do Indigenous knowledges have anything to teach us here in the 21st century? And really the question that I'm interested in is, do settler philosophical traditions teach us anything we don't already know? So the third strategy is asserting our claims on the future. So this is really important, and this is really where you can see the Indigenous futurism work coming in. So much has been written about how colonial processes work to erase Indigenous people from the ever-moving present in order to safely secure us in the past. And this line from Brian Kamali Kawada not only pushes back against those dynamics, but makes a much stronger claim. He writes, "We live in the future. Come join us." It's part of this beautiful essay that he wrote a couple of years ago around the Mauna Kea protests. But part of it, he's doing a number of things here with this kind of simple 2 sentences. So he's refusing the normative narrative of Indigenous people being all about the past and living in the past. He's acknowledging Indigenous agency in the present and in the future. And he's also making a claim about how Indigenous people have knowledge that can show us, all of us, not just Hawaiians, not just Indigenous people, but everybody on the planet, can show us some productive ways forward out of some of the challenges that we face today. And I think, something that gets lost oftentimes in the rhetoric around these sorts of things, he's positioning this as an inclusive claim, right? He's saying, hey, we live in the future. We're good with ourselves. We think we have some important knowledge. Come and join us. It's not just for us. It's knowledge that we think is beneficial to everybody. And then the fourth strategy is, let me go back. There we go. Is romanticizing our sovereignty. So this comes from Wirraju Aboriginal, Australian Aboriginal woman, Hannah Donnelly, who writes, my present is very much controlled by our history. And in this future, I can imagine we can flip that control. I am romanticizing my own sovereignty, but allowing myself to do that. So to dream freely of agency is to romanticize it, right? None of us are completely free to just do whatever we want, right? And we imagine, when we do dream about it, we tend to imagine our good actions and forget the bad, forget the negative consequences. We dream of our freedoms and forget our responsibilities. But, we must dream freely if we are to imagine worlds that grow from radically different founding assumptions. So we must romanticize our sovereignty, imagining moments, lifetimes, indeed generations and eras and epochs, living with the control flipped in order to get a feel for what it means to live self-determined lives again. And this romance also generates excitement, which in turn generates energy to confront the unending everyday challenges that must be overcome to change the narratives that are told about us, and frankly, which we tell ourselves too. And then the fifth strategy is to practice new futures together. So Adrienne Marie Brown, who's an activist and a writer, really writes some brilliant work about how to go about trying to create social change. She writes, science fiction is simply a way to practice the future together. So, the future takes practice. At least it does if we want to shape a future defined by, for instance, indigenous sovereignties. Different paths forward must be explored to disentangle us from colonization. We need to continually remember our agency while evolving it into new forms that are adapted to our lives now. How do we practice the future? That's a big part of what I'm going to be talking about in the latter 2/3 of the talk. We create new stories about how we want things to be, and we inhabit them for a while to see how they fit. We come back to them again and again, each time learning something new about their texture, how this fits with that, and how we need to change the story and modify it and evolve it. We mutate the stories and follow the permutations where they might lead. Assume we can form our identity aligned with our community's values. What do those identities consist of? Assume we can operationalize the knowledge held in our stories. How would we care for our environment differently? Assume that we see and hear our languages on the street every day. How does it change our relationship to the cities in which many of us now live? So now what I'll do is I'll give some very quick examples to just kind of give you a taste of some of the work that we've done and some of the work that other Indigenous creators have been doing to kind of sort of fill up these imaginary spaces and to kind of fill up, not fill up, but to populate, because it never gets full, right? But to kind of populate the future imaginaries that we all share. So this is Jeffrey Verege. This is a piece called Bold Steps. He's an illustrator and an artist, a visual artist, and a painter. It's super exciting. He's going to be working with Marvel over the next year to edit a series of comics bringing in Indigenous writers and illustrators. So this is a piece we commissioned from him, and as part of it, our Illustrating the Future Imaginary project, where we commission Indigenous artists to create visions of the future. This is one of the earliest ones, and I don't know why that did that. Let me see if I can get a cursor back. There we go. He wanted to imagine, he's Scullum from the West Coast of down in the States, and he wanted to imagine the first Indigenous person in space. This is a still from The Peacemaker Returns by my wife and partner, Skawanati. She's Mohawk, and The Peacemaker Returns, among many other things, it imagines a future where there's an interstellar peace that's being brokered by a young Mohawk woman who is sort of the third peacemaker from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And she goes out into space to make a peace with all these different alien species. This is Blueberry Pie in the Martian Sky by Scott Benenson-Abandan, who is an artist in residence with us, who's imagining, he's Anishinaabe, he's imagining Anishinaabe people discovering wormhole technology and using that to travel back to the stars where they came from originally. This is a VR piece. Terra Nova, this is a video game by Maze Longboat, one of my ex-students who now works with us, where he's imagining a future where the planet Earth, sometime in the past, there's ecological devastation. Half the population left to go find some other planet to live on. Half of them stayed, and then millennia later, the half that came back, the half that left, come back, but they don't realize that they've come back to Earth. And talking about the encounter, the contact that happens then. We do a series of workshops called Skins Workshops on Aboriginal Storytelling and Digital Media, where we try to combine Indigenous culture and cultural knowledge with teaching emerging young creators digital media skills. So in the workshop that we did in 2018 in the summer in Honolulu, the participants there, they created a video game that was built around this idea of Kanaka in space, Hawaiians in space, and thinking about how Hawaiians can take the incredibly well-developed navigational skills that we have in the culture and use them going off into space. This is a seventh generation descendant imagined by Kayla Tulagarjuk, who's Inuit, in a workshop that we did at the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning in Northwest Territories, where she's imagining her descendants in the future and what she'll need to survive, including these tattoos that actually act as biosensors that allow her to sense the different kinds of toxins that are in the environment. These are from another seventh generation character design workshop that we did at the Ganawagi Survival School in 2018. And these are a series of characters where we had them do the sketches and drawings like you saw with the previous one. Then we taught them how to do 3D modeling, and then we printed the characters that they had created. So each one of these characters has a really interesting backstory to it. And then some work that's not related to the work that we've been doing, but is really, really well worth going and checking out. This is The Sixth World by Nana Bob Becker, who she is Dene Navajo. And she imagines a future where Mars is being colonized, but the colony's failing because their crops are failing. So they send these Navajo astronauts there with their corn and their knowledge of corn to revive the Martian colony. This is this is one of many, many illustrations from a project called Polyfantastica by Hawaiian artist named Solomon Enos, who is sort of been kind of building out this amazing epic, 40,000 year epic of sort of Hawaiian history and then also future, and kind of imagining sort of what would have happened with Hawaii and Hawaiian culture if it was allowed to develop without colonizer influence. This is Joey Arcan's Here on Future Earth. This is part of a series of work she's done where she takes urban scapes and she replaces the English or the French in them with Cree syllabics to try to give you this idea of what it would be like to be in those urban spaces surrounded by Cree. And probably some of you have certainly heard of this. This is Bedabin First Light by Lisa Jackson, who's Anishinaabe. And this is a really beautiful sort of immersive cinema piece that imagines a future Toronto and what it might look like. So for the last third, I'm gonna slow down, go a little bit more in depth, and talk about the work that I've been doing with the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence working group as sort of a case study to give you some more texture on kind of the different levels and dimensions to this work. So in some ways, for me anyways, this work has been probably 20 years in the making. But kind of the immediate genesis for it is a essay that I co-wrote with Noelani Arista, who's a professor of history at the University of Hawaii, Archer Pachawis, who is a Cree performance artist based in Toronto, and Suzanne Kite, who's Lakota and is my PhD student. And really what we were trying to do here is the goal was to begin articulating Indigenous perspectives on artificial intelligence. And in the essay, we argue that one of the major differences between Indigenous perspectives and those from Western worldviews, within much of AI development anyways, is embedded in Indigenous emphasis on relationality with each other and with non-humans. And so in the essay we write, we believe that Indigenous epistemologies are much better at respectfully accommodating the non-human. We retain a sense of community that is articulated through complex kin networks, anchored in specific territories, genealogies, and protocols. Ultimately, our goal is that we as a species figure out how to treat these new non-human kin respectfully and reciprocally. I want to mention that, I want to emphasize that we're not the only Indigenous folks thinking similar thoughts about AI. Ambelan Kwemolina, Paliku Aboriginal sci-fi author, in 2017, she said in an interview, the fact that a life form is not human doesn't mean that they are not also my brother, sister, mother, father, grandmother, or grandfather. Further, human as a term is not a fixed category across greater cycles of existence. Indigenous systems do not contain a hard and fast distinction between the natural and the artificial. So working with several colleagues, most notably Angie Abdullah, who is an Australian Aboriginal woman, and with Oivi Parker Jones, who is Hawaiian. He's a neuroscientist at Oxford. We used the Making Kin with Machines essay as a springboard, because as we were writing this, we were like, oh, this is super interesting. We need to talk to some other Indigenous folks, both to kind of do a reality check, but also because we just thought it was really exciting and interesting that, thinking about AI, thinking about what does human mean, thinking about what does intelligence mean, just brought up some really interesting discussions around how different Indigenous traditions treat both of those concepts. So in the winter of spring, we convened 2 workshops in Honolulu. We brought 35 participants from Aotearoa, Australia, North America, and the Pacific. You can see the different nations that are represented there on the slide. We brought them together for 2 days at the end of February to just brainstorm and get to know each other. And then a subset of us went back in May to sit down and begin writing what became the position paper. And it was this was really important, and it does make me sad, like in COVID time, thinking that this wouldn't have been possible, because it was really, really critical that by inhabiting physical, emotional, and intellectual space together, the workshops provided a much needed context in which we could take wisps of whimsy and filaments of fancy and weave them together with the rough chords of our contemporary struggles and the thick braids of our ancestors' dreams to make new realities material. Such spaces are few, and those few are rarely found at the intersection of Indigenous life and the world of Western-dominated technological transformation. So out of those workshops, we created the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence position paper. It's published this last July. There's 14 long form original contributions and 18 shorter form, 1 or 2 contributions, 200 pages. So there's a lot of really interesting and rich thinking in those pages. And one of the big reasons why we did this work is that in particular, I was getting tired of, sort of having not just AI conversations, but sort of like kind of advanced computational technology conversations in general, and having the people on the other side basically be like, oh, well, we can't find any Indigenous people who work on this. We can't find any Indigenous people who think about this. And so I wanted to put a document out there that was like, look, you have no excuse now. Here's 200 pages of thinking about this from 30 different individuals and, 20 odd different kind of cultural perspectives. And, if you really want to be inclusive in the way that you're saying that you want to be inclusive, well, here's your chance. So I'm just going to look at a couple of the examples real quickly to give you some of the flavor. It was a very interdisciplinary group. It was academics, artists, technologists, language keepers, knowledge holders, community activists. And so it produced a pretty diverse document. I'm going to focus a bit on the art here just because anyways, everything else is there to read. But so I'm just going to quickly talk about a couple of the things that are captured in there. So one of them is the essay by Suzanne Kite, who, like I said, working with me on her PhD. She did a piece called, I don't know how well that looks on your screen, actually. I don't know if you can read it, but it's called How to Build Anything Ethically. And what she does is she uses Lakota cultural framework specifically around how to go about building a sweat lodge, to think through all the different stages of making essentially an AI system and how that could be done in a Lakota manner and by extrapolation to some extent in an Indigenous manner. And then she's using that approach in her art practice and making these really sort of amazing and rich interactive installations. The one that you see right here, Inyanyan Yai, is the what look like cables are actually hair braids. And so she's thinking about how the hair braid, which is very important in Lakota culture, sort of how that might both be sort of instrumented to become like kind of really active in computationally, but also sort of how to kind of construct this thing and think about this thing as being in the world, and how it relates to the relationship that she already has with her own hair braids. So this is Michelle Smith, is another PhD student that I work with, who is just finishing her dissertation at the University of Hawaii. And she's looking at, she's Basque and thinking about things from a Basque Indigenous perspective. And so trying to imagine an AI that was a relationship in Basque culture in the way that the eel is already a fundamental relationship within Basque culture, and how this could be, these ideas could be combined together to create this entity that allows you to, that sort of gets sent out into the ocean and helps them keep track of what's going on in the ocean. And so I'm going to rush through the rest of these a bit faster because I'm losing it in my time. This is a piece that I did called Quartet, which was imagining a young Hawaiian youth who is raised by 3 different AIs. So one is modeled after Hawaiian sort of worldviews about how to care for the land and to care for country. The other is modeled after Leroy Little Bear's descriptions of how the Blackfoot language, might give us insights into quantum physics. And then the third one's modeled after the way the octopus sort of sees and senses the world, particularly the aquatic world. And then there's also a great case study inside the protocol, which is Indigenous, which is where a group of people built a language app. They actually did a whole prototype within 5 days and then improved upon it, where they talk about how to use Indigenous protocols to do software development. Super useful, really, really interesting, and really great too, because for all of them, it was the first time they had worked with an all Indigenous technology development crew. And then there's also, if you want the really short version, there's a guidelines for Indigenous centered AI design, version 1. That's 2 pages, sets out some guidelines, things that we think people should, like Indigenous communities and other communities, should think about when they're developing AI. We purposely called it version 1 because we expect it's going to be localized. If it gets taken up, it will be localized to fit particular communities' needs. And then 2 just very final things that are part of that. There was a group, it's sort of like on hiatus right now, of young Hawaiian programmers and language speakers that came out of our First Skins workshop there, looking at what they call Lolo programming. So Lolo is the Hawaiian term for language, for the language, and really thinking about what does it mean to be able to program in Hawaiian language, and what's the work that needs to be done in order for that to happen, and how that changes, how that might change your approach to programming, and also how that might allow your programming to be better informed with Aloha. So lots of stuff, I'm excited about that kind of thing. And then, ultimately for me, for the current work, the goal is sort of combining the stuff that the thinking we did in the working group, what's going on with this programming collective, some work that we're doing with different technical teams to come up with what I'm calling Kanaka AI, which really just means an AI that's sort of built from the ground up from a Hawaiian perspective. And then finally, the really last thing I just had to say, I have to let you know, announce this because we're super excited about it, is that we got approval this last spring for establishing an Indigenous Futures Research Center at Concordia University. We'll be doing the opening sometime this winter, so stay tuned. So mahalo, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you listening to me today.